The Bob Woodward book, it looks as though
Bob Woodward book. Now, in all fairness,
it looks like Rob Porter and Gary Cohn were the sources, at least two of the sources for that book. Rob Porter. How does that make you feel?
I was very good to both of them. I was very good to both of them, and it could have been. A lot of people have said that. Gary Cohn, and I could tell stories about him like you wouldn't believe.
Wow. Donald Trump yesterday with, I guess, a threat against his former top economic advisor, Gary Cohn. Cohn resigned from the White House in March after clashing with the president over trade policy. We're back with Casey Hunt, Eugene Robinson, and joining the table, columnist for the Daily Beast, Margaret Carlson. Also, Don Calloway. He's founder of the National Voter Protection Action Fund, a nonpartisan 501c4 dedicated to fighting voter suppression efforts nationwide. And in New York, domestic correspondent for The Upshot at the New York Times, Nate Cohn, joins us. He covers elections, polling, and demographics. Wow. Margaret Carlson, respond to that Cohn threat. Some people, it seems Nikki Haley just got out like totally unscathed, but most people, it's not pretty. It's not pretty.
Trump is a little bit afraid of Nikki Haley.
Yeah, definitely.
And the only woman he's a bit afraid of.
He's definitely very afraid of her.
And when she said, "I'm not confused," I think that made him even more fearful.
And when she shut,
I don't get confused. It shut that down.
And when she said, when she was in her goodbye thing in the White House, she said, "I'm going to be supporting this one," and pointed at Trump. That's like bless your heart in the South.
It is.
She's not supporting Trump. Trust me.
No.
Just to translate for the president, she don't like you. She's not going to support you, and she's really glad to be leaving.
And I hope we find out later that the timing was Christine Blasey Ford and Kavanaugh. Yeah. That was a bridge too far for her.
Yep. Yeah, her timing was as good as it gets. Don, what do you think?
I think that there was this weird conspiracy theory earlier in the week about this being about Lindsey Graham going to the Attorney General's spot and ultimately Governor Haley being the new senator. Maybe so, but I think the weirdest part of that was this speculation around D.C. for a couple of hours that Ivanka would somehow be the new United Nations ambassador, which I just find fundamentally odd. But at this point in our history, there's nothing that's beyond this president's doing.
Let me help you out with that. If he could do it,
he would do it. That's right.
I promise you. And Ivanka is also planning to run for president. If you check her Instagram, she actually always has American flags around her. She goes to places like Iowa and New Hampshire. And she even, for some reason, does speeches at the podium with the presidential seal in front of it. So people can say she's not planning on running and she doesn't have aspirations.
But Nika, you can bring out that picture, which you've shown many times, of her tossing her baby in the air while the babies were being separated at the border.
Well, that's just a whole new level of cluelessness. Willie.
So up here in New York, we've got Nate Cohn, the polling guru from the New York Times. We were talking about your election night 2016 dial that left some Clinton supporters with PTSD. They wake up in cold sweats watching it move in the direction they didn't want it to move. But you've got a new feature for the midterms, a live polling feature. What does that mean exactly?
It means that we are receiving and processing data in near real time. The results come in respondent by respondent, and the results are adjusted in real time as well. So it's, methodologically not that different from a final poll, and you get to watch the results come in. And I think the real advantage of it is that it helps people understand polling a little bit better. After 2016, a lot of people were caught off guard. They don't understand why the polls are wrong. They don't necessarily understand how they work. We think that this is part of sort of maybe educating the public a little bit on what goes on inside of them, why they can be off, and hopefully, be a little bit fun in the process.
So ratcheting up that anxiety even more. Refresh.
Yes, exactly.
Refresh. Not to look backward too much, but we've talked about the polling in 2016. A lot of people say, how did they get it so wrong? How did they get it so wrong? Did they really get it so wrong, or were the margins about right when you look at the popular vote?
I think that when you look at it overall, it looks pretty good. The average of polls showed Clinton up by 4 in the popular vote. She won by 2. You can't ask for too much more than that. I do think that there was a particular challenge in the Midwest in particular, and in white working class areas more generally, where the polls tended to underestimate the president's support across the board. Obviously, in our electoral college system, that's a big issue because most of our battleground states are disproportionately white and working class. And whether that's because the polls were wrong, because they underrepresented the total number of less educated voters is one possibility, or whether it's because undecided voters broke towards the president in those areas. Those are all in play. But I do think it's fair to say that there was a particular challenge that the polls didn't get quite right.
So let's talk about some of the races specifically where you will be polling in a couple of weeks with this new live polling. Where will you be watching to see the trend of the night? We've talked about on the Senate side places like Nevada and Tennessee and even Texas here, which appears to be widening out a little bit in Ted Cruz's favor. What are you going to be watching?
On the Senate side, I'm looking for a sign that the race is going to go back to where it was a month ago. In a lot of these red states, it seems like things have trended away from the Democrats. They sort of have to win at least one of North Dakota, Texas, or Tennessee to take the Senate. And that supposes that they've won all these other states where they're in trouble, like in Missouri or Nevada. And right now, all three of the states I just mentioned, Tennessee, Texas, and North Dakota, feel like they've trended pretty steadily towards the Republicans, particularly since the Kavanaugh hearing. In the House, I think that there are 13 to 18 seats that sort of the Democrats have already taken. Yeah. And so the Republicans need to run the table in a long list of toss-up districts that are mainly in suburban areas or that are a mix of suburban and rural areas. And the question to me is, are the Democrats going to actually break through and win in those seats? They're really competitive in these races. They have a ton of money. They have good candidates. They've put a lot of districts into play. They don't need too many of them, but they haven't really won any of them yet. And if we go back to 2016, in 2016 the polls were wrong, but we knew what the polls said, and they showed Clinton ahead in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, Michigan. You could go through, anyone could look at them. Clinton's up by 1 to 6 points in all those places. Right now, I cannot tell you that about the state districts that Clinton needs, or rather the Democrats need. That doesn't mean they're not ahead there. It just means we don't have the data to say that.
And a reminder, the House needs 23 seats. The Democrats need 23 seats to flip the House. Gene Robinson has a question for you. Gene?
My question really is more about...
Gene, go ahead and I'll pass on the question. Nate's having trouble hearing you. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, my question is really, this election cycle, you've got the noise and what's really going on. And so I'd like to hear from Nate, and I'd also like to hear from Don Calloway about voter suppression efforts. And we've had some very disturbing reports about voter purges going on in a couple of states that could really impact the results. First to Nate and then to Don, I guess.
I think voter suppression is the sort of thing that can decide really close races. I think that it's not the sort of thing that, moves results by 3 or 2 points. I remember in the Alabama Senate race last December, there was a lot of concern that voter suppression was going to cost the Democrats that race. And, in the end, Roy Moore was defeated. Doug Jones became the senator with a historic black turnout. That's not to say that this isn't, an important issue that has potential to decide the closest elections, particularly in the most diverse areas. But I think that, if the election comes down to that, that would be a really troubling sign for the Democrats, given the sheer number of seats that they've put into play. Again, I want to emphasize there's a distinction between whether voter suppression is really problematic from the standpoint of our democracy, because everybody has a right to vote regardless of whether they have an ID or not. But in terms of whether it actually affects election results in a way that is even easy to detect, that's a different question for me.
Right. So that's a good point, and so let's talk about where it actually will affect an outcome, potentially in Georgia, and we're doing everything to make sure that that doesn't happen. This is what Brian Kemp does. First of all, Brian Kemp should have resigned from being Secretary of State. You have an inherent conflict of interest in being the chief election officer of the state while presiding over your own election for governor, per se. Secondly, he's done this before. In 2014, he attempted to remove 40,000 registered Georgia voters from rolls, and Stacey Abrams beat him in the courts back then. And certainly the legal standard of a compelling state interest in restricting the vote will defeat this exact match standard that he's proposed right now, in which 53,000 Georgia voters, 37,000, 70% of them being African Americans, are potentially purged from Georgia rolls. So it's a real problem. It's obviously very intentional because of this historic turnout. The best way to beat the best way to beat Georgia voter suppression or anywhere voter suppression is to come out and vote. Georgia has a record 6 million people registered to vote this November, and we've got to get them all to make sure that they're looking at the rolls, make sure that they are, unfortunately, on the Secretary of State's website is where you verify that, again, run by Brian Kemp. But they have to make sure that they're still on the rolls, have to come out and vote, and to get everybody they know to come out and vote. That's the way to beat voter suppression. But unfortunately, it still is very real, and it's still very, very prescient, particularly in the American South.
Don, I'm curious, what are the legal challenges that are going on around voter ID laws? I mean, the Supreme Court, obviously, with newly minted Justice Kavanaugh, recently, upheld a state voter ID law. Right. Is your group looking at that at all?
Absolutely. So the main thing that we're trying to do is fund actual on-the-ground election protection efforts so we can run through the tape. So fund people who can't afford voter IDs for the next 29 days, to fund rides to the polls. Randolph County, Georgia, closed substantial amounts of polling places, predominantly in African-American precincts. So what if Big Mama or aunties don't have it in their budget to make it to the other side of the county? So we're funding rides to the polls in Georgia and in 7 other states this cycle. The legal challenges are different, and you have people like the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights who are challenging right now in Georgia. We expect them to be successful because there's no way that Secretary of State Kemp can meet this exact match, this pernicious standard that he's put in place. You've got, of course, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and Sherilyn Ifill, who are doing wonderful work. A coalition of lawyers just won a case to make the Missouri voter ID law even more permissive than it already was, effectively nullifying it just this week in my home state of Missouri. So that's good news. But what we're doing is actually funding organizations who are helping people get over the actual, like, per se roadblocks that are between you and the ballot box on Election Day. But it's a fight on all fronts. You got folks who need to unelect people who support voter suppression. You've got people like us who are funding efforts for election protection, and you've got the legal side as well.
So, Gene, your latest piece is entitled Taylor, Kanye, and the Bad Blood of Politics, and you write in part this: when the big political news of the week involves Taylor Swift and Kanye West, we're in serious trouble. I'm trying to shake it off, but I can't. I don't mean to sound heartless, but we shouldn't have to pay the slightest attention to what those pop music megastars think about the midterm election and President Trump. We do pay attention, though. The celebrification of our politics is complete. Heaven help us, and we can only hope this doesn't mark the end game of American society. And in the age of social media and wall-to-wall cable news, fame matters. In 2016, Trump's fame overcame such trifles as his ignorance, lack of experience, and glaring unfitness for office. We are better off when celebrities model civic engagement. We are lost, however, if we take them seriously. And I mean, Gene and then Margaret, well, I think it's everybody's a part of this to an extent.
Oh yeah,
even the media.
I mean, we're all guilty in our way. I didn't know how else to deal with Taylor Swift and Kanye West except to make fun of the whole thing and to try to put it in some perspective. These are entertainers. They're geniuses at self-promotion and drawing attention to themselves.
Margaret and then Casey,
politics.
This is the question. I think you could have a basic answer for this. Everyone does. What the heck happened in the Oval Office with Kanye West yesterday?
It's unfathomable that he was there.
This is the hardest question that anyone is asking.
What happened?
I know. And the hat. You can, and you just
watch it, and you
first of all, you cannot parse it, and that we've come down to Swift v. West in this election. Her with her 112 million, as you point out, followers, versus West, and that. Remember equal time laws under broadcasting? Seems to me that yesterday, if we'd had to put the Mexico Beach, Florida devastation on half the screen and Kanye West and Donald Trump on the other, it would tell you everything you need to know about how far we've fallen.
Exactly. Casey, you want to try and define it?
I mean, Gene, your colleagues on the news side of your paper actually have a straight news story out today about this very topic, arguing that, Democrats are currently grappling with if they want to run against Donald Trump in 2020 and actually beat him. What do they need? You know, that there are people sitting there thinking, well, actually, maybe Oprah is the only person that actually has a shot.
Only Oprah can save us.
Right. Because this maybe this celebrity is actually something we suddenly need, or the Democrats, I should say, suddenly need if they have any hope of taking on Trump.
And Kanye was going on and on and on. The only other time I saw Trump looking like that was when Sarah Palin was introducing him back during the campaign, and she wouldn't stop talking, and he was just like, I don't know how to make her stop talking.
He met his match.
Don Calloway.
Kanye, I'm going to let you finish.
And Nate Cohn, thank you so much to you both.
Thank you.
Up next, if you've been to a pharmacy lately, you've probably seen signs encouraging flu shots, and there's a good reason why. Last flu season was the deadliest in 40 years. We've got two MDs standing by with their doctor's orders, and Willie had to run over to the Today Show, but we wanted to mention his interview this weekend on Sunday Today with the dude himself, Jeff Bridges. Oh my gosh, that's on Sunday Today with Willie Geist. And Morning Joe is coming right back.